let the sheNEDigans begin. Long live the sheNEDigans. Hello and welcome to the topic of this video. As always, let's talk some sheNEDigans. So, in inspiration from my previous video of whether or not it's okay for Catholics to play violent video games, I thought it'd be a great idea to follow suit with, is it okay for Catholics to watch horror movies? The answer is yes. Thank you for watching this video. I kid, we're still going on. So, there are a lot of things to talk about when it comes to the aspects of horror movies and Christianity. Whether or not it's technically okay to watch them, why it's not okay to watch them, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. At least according to, you know, some Christian denominations and whatnot. I mean, according to me, I think it's okay to watch horror movies, obviously. I mean, if you look at my channel, it's quite obvious I'm okay with watching horror movies. But, there are obviously many Catholics, Protestant denominations, and just, you know, some people in general who think horror movies are not good. Whether or not, you know, it's because the quality of the movies is legitimately not good, or because it teaches bad moral things, or, you know, there's a lot of elements that you have to really like look into when it comes to the aspects of horror movies. And I agree, there's actually a lot of things you should look into. As with anything in media, you have to do your research, you have to look them over and stuff like that. You know, there's a lot of things. You can't just like sit down and be like, okay, I'm going to become a horror fan now. You have to you know, kind of like slowly build into it, and you kind of have to, you know, ask yourself, okay, why am I a fan of this? Why do I like this? This is with any kind of thing. Same thing with superheroes. Same thing with any kind of video game or franchise. You know, why do you like these things? You have to have reasons and whatnot. So, what are my reasons for defending the fact that it's okay to watch horror movies and be Catholic, Christian, whatever? Well, it's really, really simple. And, I mean, the short answer is, kind of going back to my last video, is you can watch these things if you are in, you know, depending on where you are in your life. Like, if you have a good, strong faith foundation, it's okay to watch these. If you're in a good mental place in your life, it's okay to watch these. Or, in the case of horror movies in general, because horror movies and violent video games are different in this aspect, how scared you can easily get. Because the biggest difference between violent video games and horror movies is, obviously you're watching this, you are a part of it, and you are experiencing this as, you know, an audience member. So there are many times during these movies, obviously, they can scare you and all that, and if you're someone who is a bit sensitive to horror movies or scary content, then yeah, these aren't the best things for you to watch, whether or not you're Christian or not. It's best to not watch things that can have a negative impact on you, which translates over to the whole aspect of faith. One of the things that you have to ask yourself when you're processing any sort of media is this having a negative effect on me or not? And that's something everyone should ask themselves. Never mind Christians, everyone should ask themselves. Like, does this movie have an effect on my mental health? Does this movie make me incredibly paranoid or scared? Or is this movie just reminding me way too much of things in the past that have had a negative effect on me? You know, all those kinds of things. You have to really think about a lot of those things. Now, in the context of horror, because it's very different from my last video, because, like I said, you're an audience member, you're soaking this in, you're watching it, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. There are many aspects of it we're going to be talking about in this video as to why there are many Christians who are against horror movies. And the first one, this is a very loose subject, but it's still one that has been brought to my attention several times, and quite simply, it's the aspect of fear. Obviously, if you're going to watch a scary movie, you're going to get scared in some manner of speaking, at least potentially, unless you have I don't know, you're not scared of horror movies. So something that has been brought to my attention several times is when you're watching horror movies, you are, in a manner of speaking, sinning because of you're making yourself afraid on purpose, which that was one of the dumbest arguments I heard about the negative impacts of horror movies. And their reasoning was, you shouldn't be afraid because you should be putting your faith in God and stuff like that. Now, there's a huge difference between watching a horror movie and you're not putting your faith in God because of something that you're scared of. This is basically the best example I can come up with when it comes to the aspect of being scared. So with horror movies, it's like a roller coaster ride. You're watching the movie to get the thrill of being scared, or to experience a good story. Sometimes it's a good murder mystery. Sometimes there's like interesting things that you can kind of pick up and stuff like that. There are good aspects of like good versus evil in horror movies. Actually, I would argue that horror movies have the best aspects of good versus evil. Going back to, like I said, it's a roller coaster ride, as are action movies. Action movies are roller coaster rides. Horror movies are just a different kind of roller coaster ride, because this really gets your adrenaline going, and it gets you like, it's a thrill ride. I would argue that it's even closer to a roller coaster ride than action movies, because there's a lot of elements in there that are not in action movies. There's a fear of the unknown, there's anxiety, and, just being overall scared. I mean, yeah, some action movies can have that, but horror movies are more well known for having a lot of those elements. Now, there is a drastic difference between fear in a horror movie and fear in real life, because if we're going to go with the whole aspect of, you shouldn't be afraid because you have got to put your faith in God and stuff like that, God has nothing against you being afraid. He understands that when the stresses of life come around, you're going to get anxious, you're going to get scared, and all that kind of stuff. And obviously, you kind of have to realize and, put your faith that, things are going to get better, that God will lead you out of this pit of despair or whatever. But that's basically the difference. The difference is just absolutely losing yourself to fear and basically just completely throwing all sense of putting your faith in God away, and then a roller coaster ride. They are two completely different things. There's a huge difference between watching Jason go around chasing helpless teens and not knowing if you're going to be able to put food on the table for the next week. There's a huge difference. Like I said, that one's kind of a more loose argument that's really brought forward to me, but it's in a manner of speaking, kind of a faith-filled one. The next one is people identifying with or rooting for the villain in horror movies. That one I can kind of see as a more active or engaging argument, back and forth kind of thing. So I would be lying if I said, I didn't like horror villains. Obviously, I love horror villains. I love, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, all of these kinds of like monsters and villains and stuff like that. I find them very unique. I find their backstories intriguing, and I find, the things that they do as villains to be incredibly interesting. But that would be the same for a lot of other movies. It's just with horror movies, it's amped up to a 10 because they actually go freaking nuts. Now, the thing is that though, when I'm watching these movies, I don't defend the villain's actions. I find them very interesting. I find their backstories interesting. And something that I really do like to analyze and really enjoy is why they do what they do. Whether or not, it's, someone got a curse put on them. Someone got what was not being paid any attention to and wound up drowning, or they just snapped because of the monotony of life or something like that. It's these things I find very interesting because this is something I mentioned in a previous video. I always, in a manner of speaking, compare a lot of horror movies to the stories of like the Grimm fairy tales. And the reason for that is, if you read any of the original Grimm fairy tales, they are rather incredibly gruesome. They're bloody, they can be disgusting, and honestly pretty dang terrifying. And one of the reasons for those things is because they were meant to be made as moral stories. Parables, if you will. The warnings of, talking to strangers, doing certain actions, not forgiving people. There's a lot of things in those stories that are very, that can be compared to a lot of horror movies. A lot of these things are in horror movies. But it's very weird that people don't really pay attention to that. Now, the same as horror movies, the Grimm fairy tales, although some did end with happy endings, there were many that didn't. A lot of them ended sad, honestly very depressing, or were just absolutely insane sometimes, with no good happy ending, with no happy ending in general. It's very interesting because, a lot of people praise the living crap out of fairy tales, but, obviously everyone, compares them to, like, everything that Disney has made. Like, oh yeah, those fairy tales are nice, they're sweet, there's always a nice, happy ending and stuff. And then you go to, like, yeah, do you know that fairy tale, Sleeping Beauty, was based off of this Grimm fairy tale, and it's actually messed up AF, right? And then everyone is just, they don't pay attention to that, because they don't want to. It's very interesting that a lot of people kind of like push that aside, and they don't look at horror movies as moral tales. Now, there are plenty that are not. There are plenty of horror movies that are just senseless violence and are like, oh yeah, let's root for the villain and that kind of stuff. You don't want to root for the villain. You can kind of understand where they are coming from without fully giving into their ideals. Take Jigsaw, for example. There was a lot of craziness that happened with him. He found out he had cancer and just, a whole bunch of other stuff. And then eventually, when he tried to kill himself, he realized, wow, I did not appreciate my life. Now I'm really going to take full advantage of that and try to help other people appreciate their lives as well, right? Yeah, that's a good message. He does it in the most effed up way possible by torturing people, granted. But, there is that underlying message that is kind of put forward in the most gratuitous and, honestly, sometimes very disturbing way of, you didn't appreciate your life. So, you're doing like all these horrific things. So I'm going to show you just how you didn't appreciate your life by, of course, by torturing you. So, obviously, that's very different. You should never torture people. As my good friend Mark said in one of the videos, he should have became a motivational speaker instead of a psychotic killer. But the lesson is still there. The lesson of not appreciating your life is still there. It's just done in an incredibly dark way. I'm not really one who likes the Saw movies, but still, like I said, even for a movie which kind of like started a whole genre, which I like to call torture porn, there's still some kind of message there. And honestly, a pretty good one. It was after that, though, like, things were just dumb. Very, very dumb. I hate a lot of the movies that Saw inspired, to be completely honest. Those are the movies I really don't like at all. But anyway, so yeah, identifying with a villain and kind of like seeing where they're coming from, that's very different from condoning their actions. I don't ever watch Saw and say, yeah, he's got it right, he's doing the right thing. I watch something like Saw and then be like, okay, I understand where this character is coming from, but what he is doing is absolutely wrong and shouldn't be done for obvious moral reasons. So, yeah, that's that aspect. There's a lot you can take away from horror villains in horror movies. Now, the next aspect, which is talked about a lot when it comes to mainly slashers, is sex and nudity. That's something I can't necessarily defend, but I can basically talk about it in this way. Sexuality and nudity doesn't really bother me in movies. The reason for that is, well, it just doesn't. I mean, and when I say it doesn't bother me, I don't mean it in a, oh, I like it, or I think it's fine. Depending on the movie, depending on the aspect, there's I actually have a video plan talking about the aspects of sexuality and nudity in film, so this is a very brief thing I'm not really going to get into right now. It's very hard to explain. If it's done in a tasteful manner, to a degree, I think nudity in film can be okay. I'm using that term very loosely, by the way. But in a lot of horror movies, it's not done well. It's, it's there for the sake of being there. It's just like, oh, hey, here's a naked woman. Oh, hey, she's having sex now. It's there's not really a need for it. And I will agree that in a lot of horror movies, especially modern ones, they usually tend to go just way over the top and ridiculous. And I think it's very dumb. I personally don't like it, but that's me. It just depends on where you are in life. If nudity in film does bother you, don't watch it. If it does lead you to do something sinful, yeah, don't watch it. If it just bothers you, if there's any negative consequence or side effect to you watching anything that has nudity, yeah, don't watch it. But then again, if you are in a good, stable point in your life with your faith, blah, 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 so on and so forth, and you do watch it, then it's like, okay, well, it doesn't bother me, blah, 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 so on and so forth, then yeah, sure, that's okay. Like I said earlier, I'm not defending the aspect of nudity in films. It's a very sore subject, which I go back and forth on, and this is something that obviously needs to be discussed in a lot greater detail. I'm not doing it in this video. I do have a video planned for the future talking about the aspects of nudity in film. But right now I'm not really talking about that. It's a subject I neither bash or defend. So it's something like I'm very much in between, and it really depends on the context that's happening in the movie. So that's something, I'll talk about in the future. Now, the biggest part that a lot of people usually tend to complain about is the violence in horror movies, which, once again, that does depend on who you are. If that stuff bothers you, yeah, you shouldn't watch it. But this is actually an area where I get a little bit, a bit ranty, because so many Christians have talked to me and said, oh, you shouldn't watch horror movies because they're violent and, they're disgusting, the blood and gore. You shouldn't be seeing these kinds of things happening to human beings and blah, blah, blah. And my first question to them is, what's your favorite Christian movie? 90% of them say The Passion of the Christ. You're against violence in movies, huh? And yet your favorite movie, when it comes to Christianity, is The Passion of the Christ. Yeah, we're going to have some really strong words with each other. Now, before I continue on with that, you guys know me. You follow my channel. I am definitely, I'm a Christian, and I practice regularly. And honestly, I do enjoy the movie The Passion. I use the term enjoy very loosely, but I think it's a well-made movie in some regards, and I think it's a great religious experience to watch the movie in many regards. But I also don't like the idea that there are so many Christians who are willing to defend the Passion but are not okay with violent content in things in general. A lot of these times when I've talked to some of these Christians, they're like, yes, but that's Jesus. So it's okay for Jesus to get beaten to death, but not okay for, to watch, this, fictional character be beaten to death. Now, whether or not you don't believe in God at all, Jesus is proven to be a real historical figure, so he is real. Whether or not you believe in, he actually did rise from the dead, 3 days later and stuff like that. Obviously, that's your business and whatnot. But the thing is that if you're going to look at the Passion is technically based off of, real life events. Now, obviously, in the Passion in general, there were some that were kind of fabricated, but it's still a good religious experience, as I said. Now, I go back to something that I like to talk about a lot. When it comes to horror movies in general, I never like watching horror movies that are based on real life. A lot of the horror movies I watch have to do with, mummies, werewolves, giant monsters, aliens, people who rise from the dead. Oh, wait a second. So yeah, a lot of these movies I watch are more fanciful when it comes to their execution of who the characters are, the situations, the story, and all that kind of stuff. I don't really watch movies like Hush or Frozen, or there's a Frozen horror movie, by the way. It has nothing to do with good old Elsa and Olaf, although I think that movie's a horror movie all on its own. But another one is The Reef. But anyway, all those movies are well, at least with The Reef and Frozen, those are actually based off of real life events. Hush is obviously the story about a deaf woman who lives out on her own in the middle of the woods and winds up having her home invaded, and it turns into a very tense thriller-like situation. And it's honestly very tense and frightening. And I don't watch movies like that because those are movies that are either very realistic and could happen or are based off of real life events, because I, for one, don't like seeing people suffer. And if these situations are based off of people who have suffered in real life, that's not something I'm going to want to see. Putting that towards Jesus, it's obviously a very different example in many regards, because the point of the movie is not to watch Jesus suffer. Well, it kind of is to watch Jesus suffer, but it's not to enjoy it. Obviously, you're supposed to be going through it and having thoughts in your life, thoughts in your faith. What does your faith mean to you and stuff like that. So there's a lot of those aspects that when you're watching this movie, you're supposed to be thinking these things, which a lot of Christians do, a lot do, including myself. But the thing is that a lot of people defend this movie to the point where, like, oh yeah, I've shown the Passion to my 8-year-old, and I'm like, excuse me, what? You shown the Passion to your flipping 8-year-old? And yet you're not okay with them watching Jaws. So it's incredibly stupid. I'm of the same mind. No matter what movie it is, PG-13, R, whatever, you have to do your research and make sure that you're showing your kids appropriate content. I am not okay in any way, shape, or form with showing my 8-year-old or my 12-year-old The Passion of the Christ, for a lot of reasons. It's a good movie. It's a very thought-provoking movie. It's not a movie I would ever want to show to my kid who is not even a teenager yet. One argument I've heard from some people is they were shown The Passion because their parents were heavily disagreeing with some of their life choices. So they wanted to remind them of, this is what Jesus went through for you. And one, that's just doing a guilt trip on them. That's not teaching them appropriately why the things that they're doing are wrong. That's simply just, basically strong-manning them into, or guilting them into, Jesus did this for you. I've heard a lot of arguments from people who watched The Passion as a child that at that time in their life, they were doing things that, or as a teenager, that they were doing things that their parents didn't necessarily agree with. They weren't necessarily right or wrong. It was simply aspects of, for example, watching horror movies. People watching horror movies and their parents disagreed with it, or they were playing violent video games and the parents disagreed with it. So instead of, having a sit-down talk with their kid and simply going, hey, we want to talk to you about the content you are absorbing, instead, they show them The Passion and tried to guilt them into not liking what they do, not liking, what they're doing. And that's not how you do it. I've seen The Passion used way too many times for negative reasons than I have for positive. I mean, don't get me wrong. Technically, there are more positives to The Passion than there are negative. But I've seen many parents use The Passion in a negative aspect, or seen, like some families use the Passion in a negative context. But that the same goes for Christianity in general. If you're using your faith to do terrible things and you shouldn't be doing, then obviously that's not a true Christian. If you're using the Passion to kind of guilt your children or guilt people into believing in your faith, that's not what Jesus' death was about. It wasn't, he didn't die so that way we felt bad for everything that he did for us. It was, he died, for our sins. He died so, we have the chance to live again, in heaven and stuff like that. There's a lot of theological jargon. When we are processing ourselves and our faith, we have to process, what are we doing? Is what we are doing wrong? Is it sinful? Is it destructive towards me? Is it destructive towards my loved ones? Is it destructive towards society in general? These are a lot of things you have to think about as a human being. So, going back to the concept of like the Passion in horror movies, I don't agree that you can defend one aspect of film violence and not be okay with all the other ones. Don't get me wrong, there are many, many horror movies that are incredibly disgusting and are far more violent than the Passion. But to say that the horror movies or even some violent action movies are terrible to watch because these fictional characters are getting killed, and then being okay with everyone watching, the story of an innocent man being beaten to death is like, okay, why is one okay and not the other? Obviously, like I said, the Passion is obviously very different from horror movies because the story of Jesus is supposed to be good and inspirational because of all the things that he taught and, the people who tried to silence him and eventually did kill him. It goes to the same of my regard towards realistic horror movies. I don't watch them because, honestly, I do view those as negative. I do view those as, these were real people who got killed. These were real people who whose families' lives were affected by their deaths. And the same goes for the Passion. Obviously, the Passion is very different because that's Jesus, Son of God, and he did, rise from the dead and everything. And his story was obviously far more, well, the end of his story was obviously far more positive than negative. I don't know. The thing, I just don't agree with the fact that there are many Christians out there who condone the violence of Christian movies when they're okay with like, oh, I'm okay with my child watching this Bible story that's incredibly violent, or I'm okay with my child watching this Christian story that has a lot of nitty gritty stuff in it and whatever. But I'm not okay with them watching a simple horror movie which is fake. I just don't agree with that. And I think that's honestly just being picky and choosy of the content that you watch and, putting one down because it only fulfills your faith life and whatever the heck agenda you're trying to fulfill. Whereas with horror movies, it's a simple thing of entertainment. It's nothing more than that. If you're thinking that people are trying to get the meaning of life out of Friday the 13th or Halloween, then oh boy, you don't know movie audiences. So, I mean, these movies can be thought-provoking in a manner of speaking, but for the most part, they're just movies. They're just movies, that's it. And then going back to the aspect of, the only thing horror movies promote are evil. Honestly, if you watch any proper horror movie, and I'm talking about not ones that are just gore-filled and needless content and stuff like that. If you do truly watch any of these movies, you can compare them to the Grimm fairy tales and basically look at them as tales of warning of things that you should and shouldn't do. And if you do watch other kinds of horror movies, honestly, horror movies have some of the best examples of good versus evil. If you watch movies like The Conjuring or any of like the Dracula movies or The Exorcist or literally any kind of like legitimate like good horror movie that has There's a lot of good versus evil. Even Friday the 13th, Halloween, there's good versus evil in these aspects. And even with some of the earlier examples I used, they actually bring out Christian and Catholic characters to fight against the evil. So it's really weird that there are so many Christians against horror movies just because it's, well, dark and spooky. There's absolutely nothing wrong with watching horror movies. Horror movies, in my opinion, give some of the best examples of good versus evil. They have some incredibly great content, and for the sole fact that there are many Christians and Catholics who push the whole, the whole genre aside just because it's either, gory or something like that, then, it's really stupid. Especially because of the fact that they're okay with movies like The Passion. And if you're not okay with The Passion and you don't like horror movies, then hey, do you know what? I actually give you a lot more props to your decisions in not liking violent content than people who are okay with The Passion and not okay with horror movies. Because, well, like I said, I don't think it's okay to like one thing that's incredibly violent and then not be okay with something that's incredibly violent. So anyway, that's basically it. I know I kind of went on a little bit of a rant. Maybe I might have gotten a little bit sidetracked or something, but I feel very passionate when it comes to the aspects of being a Catholic and watching horror movies. I love horror movies. They tell some of the greatest stories I've ever seen in a genre at times. They can have really great mysteries. They have some really great characters to analyze and talk about. And on top of that, they can sometimes just be cheesy fun. But most of them are all aspects of good versus evil and right versus wrong. There's always positive things that you can take out of horror movies. Well, for the most part. There are some horror movies, as I mentioned, that are just needless bullcrap. There's absolutely nothing good in them. But for the most part, the horror genre is ripe with some really good stuff. And going back to what I said earlier in the video, if this stuff bothers you, more on a mental level, because you just like, oh, okay, I can't stand blood and gore. I don't like seeing, sex and nudity. I don't like seeing any of this kind of stuff in my movies because it has an effect on me. Then I completely understand. But if you're just throwing out the whole genre because you think it's morally wrong to watch any of this stuff, then I'm sorry. I don't think I can have a good conversation with you. I always go back to that one person who came up to me and said, horror movies are the cigarette of the soul. Even to the point where he was asking, personal information about my life, about, have you been having nightmares from horror movies? I'm like, no. What I wanted to tell him was, no, I have nightmares of freaking crappy Christians who tell me that this is going to send me to hell, but being a complete jerk to another human being is not going to send me to hell. Then, yeah, that stuff bothers me, okay? You can't judge people for who they are and what in their life, and what they're going through, what they're doing, what they're watching, because you don't know what they're doing. You don't know what they're getting out of it. You don't know whether or not, if they are getting anything positive, out of this stuff and whatnot. And overall, the genre of horror is not a bad thing, okay? It's not sinful to watch. It's not bad. Some of the greatest moral tales, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to Christianity in general, come from horror. Huge defender of horror. And if you guys disagree with me, I really want to know why. And because the thing is that, as I mentioned in the earlier video with violence in video games, if you disagree with me, that's fine. But what needs to be done is not just to guilt people into not liking them. You need to have a proper discussion with them on why you disagree or don't like certain content. If you just go oh, Jesus doesn't like it, well, that's not a good argument. Or, Jesus died for your sins, so you shouldn't watch that. Once again, dumb argument. It's even a nonsensical argument. In that regard, or these movies are filling your life with negativity, that's also another dumb argument. Like I said, if you disagree with me, I would really like to know why, and maybe some of your reasons, because I would love to have these conversations. I love having good, respectful conversations on people who do disagree with my opinions, because I think it's very constructive, and I think there's a lot of things that you can get out of it. So I'm very, very interested in what you guys would have to say about with what I said. Whether or not that is positive and you agree with me, or it's negative and you disagree with me. So I really want to hear what you guys have to say. So yeah, that's basically it. Thank you so much for watching my rant for today. Make sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel. Also make sure to like the video, share it around with your friends and family. And then on top of that, also make sure to follow us on social media with Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And last but not least, if you guys can, I would appreciate it if you could look into my Patreon. Anything as low as $1 a month would be, I would greatly appreciate in your support for the channel. And if you go any higher, hey, I also appreciate that as well. You guys take care, God bless, and stay safe out there, okay? I'm praying for all of you, and I love you all. Thank you so much.